your death, this nightmare finally end. I'm thunder. I'm too quick.
I shall cast you into a pit of infinite torches.
Welcome! Time has no meaning here. Your pain will be endless. Distasteful! I am.
is a veil. You exist in the center.
Hey guys, Darkflame here, and this is my very first Path of Exile video showcasing my Cold Dot Occultist. There are a few cold damage over time skills that exist in Path of Exile, such as Creeping Frost and Wintertide Brand, but I chose to build around Vortex and Cold Snap as they give the perfect balance of one-button mapping and concentrated damage on a single target. Before I continue, I must stress that this is more of a build showcase than a build guide, as I don't remember enough about the specifics of this build to make an in-depth guide that covers league start, mid-budget options, skill tree pathing, and so on. In the description, I have included video links that direct you to 3 guides that I've watched and followed in order to reach the point that I have in this build, so please check them out if you are curious as to how to progress this build in, say, a league start environment. Next, I will discuss the gear and skill links in this build. Because certain skills are supposed to go into certain slots of the gear, I will talk about each piece of gear as well as the skills that go into it. First, I want to talk about my wand. I want to give a detailed description on how to best scale your vortex damage with your wand. For this, I went into Path of Building Community Fork, then I tested what different wand configurations would bring in terms of damage. Of course, when you apply this method to your build, the numbers will be different due to different equipment, passive tree, and so on. But this chart will give you a good idea as to what to look for in your wand to boost your damage over time DPS. According to this chart, the largest boost to damage over time DPS are the +1 mods, followed by cold damage over time multiplier, and finally spell damage. Keep in mind that increased spell damage, cold damage, and elemental damage give the same damage values, while damage over time multiplier and cold damage over time multiplier are the same for damage. What does this chart mean for your wand setups then? This means that, to start, you should have a +1 cold wand with at least the lowest roll of cold damage over time multiplier or 44% increased spell damage. The last 2 values give essentially the same DPS increases in Path of Building. Then, as you get more currency, you can get a wand very similar to the one that I've showcased by simply factoring T1 Cold Dot with Harvest, then spamming Frigid Fossils on the wand till you get +1 cold, then multi-modding or adding trigger according to your budget. I will release a guide on how to craft my wand in a different video, which I will link in the description once it's up. Because this wand has a trigger craft on it, certain skills have to be socketed into the wand in order for them to be triggered when you cast a skill. On the wand, I have Stormbrand, Orb of Storms, and Frostbomb in that order. This is important because the trigger craft on your wand allows you to automatically cast these skills when you cast a spell, with a 5-second cooldown for each skill. The casting order would go like this. You would cast any spell, whether it be Vortex, Cold Snap, or Flame Dash. Then the wand casts Stormbrand since it is the first skill gem in the wand. Then it would be casting Orb of Storms, and lastly Frostbomb afterwards. Stormbrand and Orb of Storms allow you to proc Elemental Equilibrium and Elemental Overload, which are 2 large damage boosts to this build, and I will explain their mechanics later in the video. Some people replace Frostbomb with an increased critical strike support to more consistently proc Elemental Overload, but I decided to run Frostbomb instead and get the critical strike chance elsewhere. Frostbomb gives us the occasional cold exposure debuff, which reduces cold resistance by 25%, as well as reducing enemies' life regeneration, energy shield regen, and energy shield recharge. Frostbomb is good for damage boosting as well as negating the Maven's vitality boon when she witnesses boss fights. Next, I want to talk about my helmet. Most cold damage over time builds use Rime Gaze, which is an excellent choice because it gives high amounts of energy shield and cold damage over time multiplier. People often socket their Cold Snap link here to get the benefits of the concentrated effect modifier from the helmet. I had one big problem with this helmet, however, the 50% reduced energy shield recharge rate. Since we are running this build with Wicked Ward, which prevents energy shield recharge from being interrupted by damage if recharge started within the last 4 seconds, we want as much energy shield recharge rate as possible. With Rime Gaze on, you will only be able to regain a base maximum of 40% maximum energy shield at 10% energy shield per second, not counting other mods that affect energy shield recharge rate. I've found that in certain situations, such as in areas where you get large, semi-sustained damage from monsters, this difference in energy shield recharge could mean life or death for your character. Because of this, I set out to craft a helmet that was even better than Rime Gaze in terms of damage, but also gives me that little defensive boost. I started with obtaining an eye level 85 Hubris Circlet with the Vortex damage enchantment, then slamming on a Redeemer's Exalted Orb to get Redeemer influence. Then, I would spam Frigid Fossils on the item until got nearby enemies have -9 to cold resistance, and no other influence mods. Then, I bought an Awakening base for the helmet, a Shaper helmet with the mod nearby enemies take 6% increased elemental damage, and no other influence mods. Then I Awakener orbed that base onto my Redeemer helmet. You have to be sure that when you Awakener orb, you do it in the correct order, Awakener orbing the Shaper base onto the Redeemer base, or else you're going to lose the Vortex enchantment in the Hubris Circlet base. If, after using your Awakener's orb, the resulting item doesn't have a freeze suffix and you can't remove the last suffix, just craft Aspect of the Spider on something else and put your curse setup there. Then I simply use a Harvestcraft Reforge keeping suffixes until I got a good amount of energy shield. Since my Aspect of the Spider is crafted on my helmet, I put my curse setup here as well. I chose Aspect of the Spider for this build because all of the other aspects do not benefit us as much as this one does. This one gives us a chance to debuff the enemy with up to 90% reduced movement speed and 50% increased damage taken if we are able to stack 3 spider's webs on them. For the curses, I use Enfeeble and Frostbite as they give me a good balance of DPS and defenses. Enfeeble reduces the accuracy rating and damage dealt by monsters affected by the curse, while Frostbite greatly reduces their cold resistance and gives freeze duration and freeze chance. If you want, you can drop Frostbite for Temporal Chains for additional defense, or if you don't have enough reduced mana reservation to run 2 curses and Aspect of the Spider on your mana. I linked the curses to an Awakened Blasphemy, which not only gives massive increased AoE for the curses supported by it, but also curse effect and +1 to supported curses, which gives you just that little bit of extra curse effect. You can drop this for a regular Blasphemy if you want, but Awakened Blasphemy was very cheap for me, and so I picked it up. Lastly, I socketed an Enlighten 4 into the 4 link. This not only reduces the mana reservation for our curses, but for Aspect of the Spider as well. Enlighten 4 is pretty much required to socket your curses into the gear and run them, as if you don't have Enlighten 4, you may not have enough mana to reserve Aspect of the Spider or even cast skills. Now we have the 3 build enablers, and I'm going to go through these as fast as possible as it is pretty much impossible to replace these items, especially since we are low life and the harvest nerfs are coming after patch 3.13. First is the Chevron's Wrappings, which is a default body armor for low life builds, since it prevents chaos damage from going through energy shield. I got here the highest rolls I could manage, and we used the energy shield and lightning resistance pretty effectively. I did not get a double corrupted Shavs or a +1 Shavs because all of my Shavs failed when I put them all to the Corrupting Temple level 3. For the links, we have our Vortex setup, with a level 21 Vortex socketed with Awaken Control Destruction, Awaken Elemental Focus, Awaken Swift Affliction, Efficacy, and Hypothermia. You can drop the Awaken skill gems if you want, but I lost around 600k damage over time DPS from doing this. I would go for Awaken skill gems after you get a decent wand, as a wand like mine is going to be expensive to craft. One thing to note here is that Awaken Swift Affliction gives us more damage than the non-Awaken variant, but it causes our Vortex to have a 25% reduced duration. I personally did not find this a problem, but just in case you notice that your vortices are not lasting as long as they used to, that is why that is happening. Presence of Chiyula is the second mandatory piece of equipment for low life builds. It gives stun immunity, large amounts of chaos resistance, and a percentage of your life converted to energy shield. I tried to replace Presence of Chiyula with a +1 cold, +1 intelligence amulet, but I found that making up for the chaos resistance and the stun immunity that I lost was simply too troublesome to bother with. The best anointment with this build would be Tranquility, as it gives you energy shield and Transfiguration of Mind. Transfiguration of Mind causes increases to energy shield to apply the damage at 30% of their value. Since we are scaling energy shield here, we get a nice bit of damage boost as well, in my case 11% more damage. If you want, you can replace this anointment with resistances, energy shield, or whatever anointment you can afford, but I recommend changing the anointment as soon as it is convenient for you. Lastly, for the catalyst, I chose Tempering Catalyst as they increase the amount of life that is converted to energy shield. You can change this out for Prismatic Catalyst to boost Chaos Resistance, or Intrinsic Catalyst for attributes as needed. Lastly, Prism Guardian is a standard shield used by low-life builds to reserve auras on life. It also causes them to have reduced mana reservation, which, combined with the reduced mana reservation on the passive tree, allows us to reserve 3 50% auras: Hatred, Malevolence, and Zealotry. Zealotry gives us more spell damage, Hatred gives us more cold damage, and Malevolence gives us more damage over time and skill effect duration. In terms of the stats, I went for the maximum dexterity roll I could get, since this build needs dexterity. I did not go for the expensive +2 AoE or +2 aura corruptions, because we actually need the elemental resistances implicit on the shield to cap out our resistances. If you can cap out your resistances without this implicit and you have the money to buy the corruptions, then you can go right ahead and do that. Next, I'm going to quickly talk about the rings that I use in this build. The rings that I have equipped currently are the Mark of the Shaper Opal Ring and an Elder/Crusader influence Opal Ring. My Mark of the Shaper has the highest roll on increased spell damage if your other ring is an Elder item, enhanced with Imbued Catalyst, and the highest rolls on life and energy shield that I could manage. Of course, this means that the other ring has to be an Elder base to make use of the mod on the Mark of the Shaper, but I also went ahead and made it a Crusader base as well through an Awakener's Orb. This is because I wanted the % spell damage and the % maximum energy shield mods on the ring, which are both Crusader influence mods. As you can see, the mods are not tier 1, but I got them on there after a little bit of harvest crafting. I used harvest crafting to get these mods, as well as the resists, but you can spam dense fossils on the ring until you get both Crusader mods, and then Prismatic Catalyst and the Harvest Craft reforge keeping suffixes to get decent resistances. According to Phoenix, which is one of the people who made a video on the Vortex Cold Snap Occultist, this costs around 10x worth of dense fossils and resonators. You can also change the base into a 2-stone ring if you are having trouble balancing your resistances, or you can drop the Crusader influence entirely and simply go for an Elder ring with energy shield and resistances. Next up are the best pair of gloves for this build. Here I have an eye level 85 fingerless silk gloves with this suffix +2 cold damage over time multiplier. You can get this suffix on a Hunter or Shaper influenced pair of gloves. The Shaper bases are cheaper and look cooler, but is easier to roll tier 1 cold damage over time multiplier on the Hunter bases, as you can see here. I used harvest crafting to get the chaos resistance and energy shield, but you can just go with any pair of gloves with the cold damage over time mod, good energy shield, and some resistances. In terms of what I socketed onto my gloves, I went with a 2-link of Flame Dash linked with an appropriately leveled Arcane Surge support so that we get Arcane Surge every time we use Flame Dash. At this level, Arcane Surge gives us 13% more spell damage, 12% increased cast speed, and a bit of mana regeneration, all of which we can use. On a separate link, I put in my 2 remaining auras, which is a Vaal Discipline and a low-level Clarity. As a matter of fact, these 2 skill gems don't necessarily have to be linked. Vaal Discipline, when activated, allows you to recharge energy shield without it being interrupted by damage. I use this to prevent being burst down in sticky situations, or to regenerate energy shield quickly after I've taken a large amount of damage from a boss. More importantly, this low-level Clarity I have here allows me to continuously cast Vortex, Cold Snap, and Flame Dash without running out of mana. I ran it at an appropriate level so that I can cast all 3 spells sequentially and still be able to regenerate the mana back, at least for the most part. Sometimes I still hear the witch saying, I need more mana, every once in a while, but Clarity definitely helps out with your mana problem. Now I'm going to explain my selection for boots. For those who are not familiar, these boots are DreamQuest slippers. DreamQuest slippers, which was a base introduced in Ritual League, gives us increased cooldown recovery rate of movement skills at the cost of 10% movement speed. At this level of implicit, this is essentially a second wind support linked to our Flame Dash. Since we don't have as much increased movement speed as an Occultist as would, say, a Raider, I primarily use Flame Dash to get around, as these boots allow me to spam it more frequently. I actually recommend pivoting from DreamQuest slippers into Sorcerer's boots if you're following this build in the future, as it will be harder to roll the mods as well as obtain the proper base after Ritual League. Eye level 86 is required to be able to roll the 35% movement speed mod and tier 1 elemental resistance modifiers. I used these boots to cap out my elemental resistances as well. In the Eternal Labyrinth, I enchanted these boots with the enchant Increased Critical Strike Chance if you haven't dealt a critical strike recently, so that I could put Frost Bomb in my trigger wand instead of increased critical strikes. This is entirely optional, and you can go instead for a movement speed enchant on these boots. As for the sockets, I have my Cold Snap set up. Vol Cold Snap allows me to, when I have enough souls, simply activate it and run around killing monsters, almost like a Righteous Fire build. This is simply a QOL thing and is not actually required, but I recommend it personally. Linked to Cold Snap, I have Hypothermia, Efficacy, and Bone Chill. Hypothermia and Efficacy boost the damage of Cold Snap up to doubling its damage in Path of Building. Bone Chill is a gem that, when linked to Cold Snap, allows enemies chilled by Cold Snap to take increased cold damage over time, as well as increased cold damage based on chill effect. On this build, you can see I have a 251% increased chill effect, and as a result I am able to get massive damage boost from my Cold Snap as well as my Vortex when the monster is affected by chill from Cold Snap. Last but not least, I have my belt. I took an eye level 84 crystal belt and slammed it with the Crusader's Exalted Orb to gain Crusader influence on it. I spammed Den Fossils on the belt, which I also used Tempered Catalyst on in its normal form, until I got tier 1 increased maximum energy shield and no other influence mods. Next, I obtained a shaped belt with tier 1 increased energy shield from body armor and Awakener orbed it onto this belt. Usually you can just craft on whatever you can craft onto the belt and call it a day. However, I got % increased cooldown recovery rate and % increased energy shield recovery rate as a result of the Awakener's orb. I then used Harvest to craft spell damage during Flask effect, which I got on my first Augment Caster craft, as well as free up a prefix. Keep in mind that you won't be able to do this after the Harvest nerfs. For your remaining prefix, you can craft Hybrid Energy Shield as I did here, or Leo's % increased damage modifier. I finished the item with Tempered Catalyst to maximize my energy shield. Now we're going to look at our passive tree and discuss the choices that I made there. Before I continue, keep in mind that this passive tree is my endgame level 98 passive tree. Different choices in pathing are made in different stages of the build, so please check out Shack Central's video in the description to look at an in-depth guide discussing pathing during leveling. If you are interested in cluster jewel setups, please look at Path of Math's Cold Slinger video to get started on how to begin the path for cluster jewel setups. First, we're going to talk about the Ascendancy passives. Void Beacon is the first passive that we get, as it gives nearby enemies -20 to cold resistance, as well as reducing their life regeneration by a significant amount. This, once again, is very helpful against Maven's Vitality boon, preventing the map boss from regenerating large amounts of HP. Next, we go into Frigid Wake, which gives us freeze and chill immunity and more cold damage. This allows us to save a flask slot. It also allows us to freeze nearby chilled enemies every 4 seconds, as well as freeze nearby chilled unique enemies every 4 seconds with a 33% chance. In addition, it reduces the damage dealt with hits by chilled enemies by 10%. These are all very nice offensive and defensive layers for this build. Profane Bloom allows us to curse hexproof enemies and causes cursed enemies to explode with a 40% chance, dealing a quarter of their life as chaos damage. This helps us out a lot with clearing maps and densely packed monsters. Our last Ascendancy passive, Malediction, gives us an additional curse effectiveness, and the Malediction debuff against cursed enemies. Enemies affected by Malediction deal 10% reduced damage and take 10% increased damage. Malediction allows us to run a second curse, and the Malediction debuff gives us a good balance in offense and defense. On to the passive tree. As you can see, I took the Energy Shield path up to Pain Attunement, but if you're lacking in passive points, you should take the shortest path up to Pain Attunement. I'll explain why I made this change later. Pain Attunement is the reason we go low life, as it grants 30% more spell damage while we are below 30% life. We also pick up Deep Wisdom along the way for the Intelligence and Flat Energy Shield. Next, we path down towards the Melding Wheel and the Jewel Socket close by. In the jewel socket, we socket in the unique Cobalt Jewel energy from within, which gives energy shield and converts the increased life we get from this wheel here into increased energy shield, as you can see here. When I remove the jewel, the small passives leaving up the melding as well as the melding notable give life and energy shield, but when I put the jewel back in, it gives us increased energy shield only. We do not take Arcane Vision, at least I don't, since having increased light radius in indoor locations is not worth the additional passive point. We go up from the Painted Tomb and Keystone to pick up the first large jewel socket that we will be using, then path down towards the right to pick up several key notables. Fingers of Frost, with this specific pathing, gives us the most cold damage multiplier as well as other bonuses such as Chill Effect and Chance to Freeze. Then we path on towards the No Witnesses notable by first grabbing Soul Thief in this particular pathing. Doing this will give us Energy Shield as well as Elusive Effect. If for some reason you don't like to go fast during mapping, you can drop No Witnesses to save points or invest them elsewhere. Now we go into our first Cluster Jewel setup. Cluster Jewels greatly increase the damage of this build and are not too expensive to set up. If you are short on passive points, I would recommend just running the second setup, which I show later, until you get some levels. This large Cluster Jewel here is essentially used twice in this build, except this one has Prismatic Heart while the other does not. Prismatic Heart allows me to cap my resistances as well as damage, but you can skip this if you don't need it or you don't have enough passive points for it. Deep Chill gives us Chill Effect as well as cold damage over time multiplier, while Disorienting Display gives us damage and chances to blind enemies when you use an elemental skill. Since you will be using elemental skills pretty much all the time and you will be using 2 Disorienting Display notables, the blind will be up on nearby enemies for the majority of the time. Blind gives us a 50% evasion chance against attacks, which is a good defensive layer. Both medium cluster jewels we use here have Deep Chill as well as Brush with Death. Brush with Death gives us damage over time multiplier as well as life and energy shield recovery on kill. This is the main way we sustain ourselves during mapping. Lastly, the 2 small cluster jewels here both have energy from Knot, which is a massive flat energy shield boost. On the jewels, I got as much elemental and chaos resistance as I could get, and I even got good corruptions on both of them. This one has increased effect of non-damaging ailments, and this one has corrupted blood immunity. Moving on, we have allocated Essence Surge, which gives us a bunch of flat energy shield as well as energy shield recharge rate and faster start of energy shield recharge. The small passive points here gives us those bonuses as well. We also pathed down towards Wicked Ward. I honestly thought that Wicked Ward was not worth the 2 passive points, but after playing with it for a while, I was able to feel firsthand how powerful this keystone really is. Wicked Ward prevents energy shield recharge from being interrupted by damage if recharge began recently, or in the past 4 seconds. This allows us to survive certain situations as I explained earlier. If you take a lot of damage, all you need to do is step back for about 2 seconds and your energy shield recharge will start and it won't be interrupted by damage once you go back into the fight. The drawbacks of this keystone, reduced energy shield recovery from energy shield leech and reduced energy shield regeneration rate, do not affect us as we do not leech or regenerate insignificant amounts. We continue to path towards the left side of the passive tree into Breath of Rime. This notable is very powerful as it gives us cold damage over time, cold damage, cold ailment effect, and buffs to freeze. As you can see, the path up towards it gives us the same bonuses. In very high levels, you can path up to this area to get more DPS, or, like I did, invest the extra points in defenses. This is because you can allocate Breath of Rime without spending the additional passive points by using a Thread of Hope, which is what I use to get other notables. Thread of Hope is a crimson jewel that allows us to allocate passive points in a certain area at the cost of reduced elemental resistances. I place it in a specific jewel socket, this one, and make sure it affects passive in the large ring to get the following notables. Utmost Intellect for Intelligence, as well as the bonuses to Energy Shield and Mana when we stack Intelligence, Snowforge for critical strike chance, cold damage, and resistances, Arcane Focus for Energy Shield and Energy Shield recharge rate, and Practical Application for Strength and Dexterity. You saw that I allocated the small Energy Shield passive point up to Arcane Focus, but you don't have to do this. We take Unnatural Calm here as I go toward the left side of the tree for a lot of energy shield, increased energy shield recharge rate, and maximum lightning resistance, but I don't take the whole wheel here since we don't necessarily need it. We take the second large jewel socket here, moving on to the Sovereignty wheel, and taking all the reduced mana reservation here as well. This allows us to run every single aura that I listed earlier in the guide, except for Discipline, without problems. I'm going to talk about how I was able to get enough reduced mana reserve to run Discipline right now. As I mentioned earlier, this second large cluster jewel is a duplicate of the first one, except for the Prismatic Heart notable, which this one doesn't have. The medium cluster jewels are different from the ones shown earlier in that they both have Self-Control and Vengeful Commander. Vengeful Commander gives us Hatred increased aura effect and can be dropped if necessary, but Self-Control is an absolutely necessary notable. Self-Control reduces the mana reservation of Discipline by 30%, which, if stacked 2 times, allows us to reserve Discipline with our curses and Aspect of the Spider on our mana. If you do want to skip Vengeful Commander, be sure you grab a 4 passive medium cluster jewel with % increased effect of non-curse auras and roll Self-Control on it so that you don't need to spend an extra point for the jewel socket. On one of the jewel sockets, we run a split personality with strength and dexterity to meet our requirements for the gear and gems. As you can see, Awakened Swift Affliction requires 126 dexterity, while Prism Guardian requires 85 strength. The other jewel socket is a Watcher's Eye with % increased damage over time multiplier while affected by Malevolence. These jewels are not cheap, that is, the Watcher's Eye, and they cost about 10 Exalt each, and can be replaced with another jewel or dropped altogether if needed. This jewel allowed me to drop the small passive nodes leading up to Breath of Rhyme, and instead allowed me to take the Energy Shield path towards Pain Attunement. Pathing down from the large jewel socket, we pick up Elemental Overload and the Insightfulness wheel. Elemental Overload gives us more elemental damage if we quit recently at the cost of dealing no extra damage with critical strikes. We use Stormbrand and Orb of Storms on our trigger wand to proc Elemental Overload for us. The Insightfulness wheel gives us mana, energy shield, intelligence, and reduced mana cost of skills while on full energy shield. The reduced mana cost of skills isn't really too great as the uptime on it is too inconsistent to reliably reduce the mana cost of our skills. I pick up the jewel socket on the way down to Elemental Equilibrium and socket in a generic jewel with cold damage over time multiplier, energy shield, and whatever mods you happen to get. I used cold resistance here to cap my resistances. The last notable this build uses, Elemental Equilibrium, is very useful in increasing our single target DPS. If you allocate Elemental Equilibrium, enemies you hit with elemental damage get plus 25 resistance to that element and minus 50 resistance to other elements. This slightly reduces our DPS against weak mobs, but we have enough DPS to kill them despite this. With big bosses, the way Elemental Equilibrium works is that you cast Vortex underneath them, which hits the enemy and gives them plus 25 cold resistance. Once you trigger your Stormbrand and Orb of Storms, and they hit the enemy, they override Elemental Equilibrium's initial effect, causing the target to instead have minus 50 to cold resistance, since they are lightning skills. This will last until you hit them with another cold skill, in which Stormbrand and Orb of Storms will override Elemental Equilibrium again. If you have not found the trigger craft yet, proc Elemental Equilibrium by casting a Stormbrand occasionally as you are fighting a large target. We finish up the passive tree by picking up Foresight, which gives us % energy shield, flat energy shield, and energy shield recharge rate. Now I will quickly go over the Flasks, Bandit, and Pantheon. As I discussed earlier, we're going to need as many passive points as we can get, so we are going to be killing all of the bandits. In our Flasks, we first have a Quartz Flask with Bleed Immunity. Quartz Flask gives us phasing, which allows us to pass through monsters and simply kill them with the vortices that we drop behind us. It also gives us a bit of defense with 10% chance to dodge, attack, and spell hits. Next we have a Cinder Swallow urn with high rolls to recover energy shield on kill, and any mod that you can get cheaply. Ideally, this would be an increased critical strike chance during Flask effect, or movement speed chance to avoid stun. You can take advantage of the enemies ignited by you during Flask effect, take 10% increased damage, by getting flat fire damage to spells on any jewel and placing it on your tree. I chose not to do this since I don't like to rely on Cinder Swallow for DPS, I just use it for sustain during mapping. Moving on, I have a Rumi's Concoction with high rolls to attack and spell block. This flask makes us a lot tankier against all forms of damage because it gives us that block chance as well as 3000 armor. The 4th flask can be interchangeable between a Basalt flask for additional tankiness or a Sulfur flask for damage, but either way the flask has to have curse immunity. If you don't mind getting cursed, as some people don't, you can roll a Ball of Faith instead. Lastly, we have a generic Quicksilver flask with increased movement speed during flask effect to go fast during mapping. For the major Pantheon, I go with a fully upgraded Lunaris for mapping and a fully upgraded Solaris for bossing. If you fully upgrade these Pantheon, like I did, they will give you large boosts to tankiness and utility when you have enemies near you, as in mapping, or when there is only one target near you, as in bossing. For the minor Pantheon, I chose to run a fully upgraded Abrath for reduced ignite duration and a bunch of other decent stats as well. The upgraded Abrath Pantheon, along with reduced ignite duration on some of the jewels, as you can see here, can basically render ignites on you useless. Thank you for watching my very first Path of Exile video. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe to see more content like this, such as a crafting guide for the wand I showed earlier, as well as more build guides in the future.